I had been backpacking in New Hampshire with a group of friends, planning for a relaxing time out in the wilderness. The trail we were following had been simple enough, and by the time we set up camp for the night at 13 Falls in the White Mountain National Forest, everything felt right. The weather was cool but not too cold, the sky clear, and we had the usual evening campfire going with some food cooking over it. As the evening wore on, we found ourselves sitting in a circle by the fire, enjoying the warm light and the crackle of burning wood. It had been a great hike, and I was feeling pretty good. I had hiked this trail before, but this time it was different. The forest felt alive, not in the mystical, romantic sense you hear about, but more in the way a forest can feel. Distant, ancient, and full of things that might be watching but don't reveal themselves easily. I tried to push that feeling out of my mind. After a while, I stood up to stretch. The firelight flickered across the trees, casting long shadows that made the woods seem even darker. I had to pee, so I decided to wander off a little bit. Nothing out of the ordinary, just stepping away from the fire to handle my business. The night was still. The only sounds the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a branch. I walked away from the campsite, following a narrow path that led deeper into the woods. The moonlight was faint, barely enough to see by, but I didn't mind. I knew the area well enough, or at least I thought I did. I found a small patch of clearing and, standing off the trail, started to take care of things. The moment I finished, I turned back toward the fire, but something caught my eye. Just off to the side, there was a strange mark in the ground. At first, I thought it was just the way the light hit the earth, a trick of shadow and stone. But then I realized it was something more deliberate. There was a perfect circle etched into the dirt, about 5 feet in diameter. Inside the circle were several metal tuning forks, stuck upright in the ground like strange sentinels. They were arranged around the edge of the circle, spaced evenly apart. I froze. The first thought that crossed my mind was that it had to be some kind of prank. Someone must have come out here before us and left it for us to find. But something about it didn't sit right with me. The forks were too perfectly arranged, too intentional, and the way they were positioned, each one standing straight up, no signs of being disturbed, felt off. The dirt around the circle was smooth, like it hadn't been touched in years, even though the rest of the forest floor showed signs of being walked on. A knot formed in my stomach. I wasn't the kind of person to get spooked easily, but this was something different. I didn't feel like I was in a normal place anymore. It wasn't just the sight of the forks or the odd circle. It was the way the air felt. It felt thick, almost heavy, like the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. I took a few steps closer to the circle, drawn to it despite myself. I wanted to know what this was, how it got there, who made it. But at the same time, I didn't want to touch it, didn't want to disturb whatever strange thing was happening. I wasn't about to mess with anything out here. I had heard enough stories about weird rituals and spooky happenings in places like this to know that you don't interfere. So I stood there, staring at it. My heart was beating faster than usual now. I felt paranoid, like something was watching me. I could almost hear the sound of the wind moving through the trees, but it wasn't the same as before. It felt like it was moving in a way that was more deliberate, like the trees themselves were shifting, observing. Suddenly, I heard a rustle behind me. My stomach dropped, and I snapped my head around. But there was nothing. The woods were silent again. No animals, no wind, nothing. Just me, standing there, staring at the circle and those damn tuning forks. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. I knew then that I needed to leave. I don't know why, but I had this overwhelming sense of urgency, like whatever I was standing near wasn't meant to be found. I wasn't even sure if I had truly found it on purpose, or if I had been led here somehow. I didn't think about it too hard. I just turned and walked away as fast as I could. I didn't run, not at first. I wasn't sure if I was being irrational or if I had just let my imagination get the better of me. But the further I walked, the more I felt the pressure build. It was like the air was heavier now, and the woods were getting closer, closing in around me. By the time I broke through the trees and made it back to the campsite, I was nearly breathless. The fire was still crackling, and the group was sitting around it, chatting and laughing. I could hear them, but I couldn't shake that sense of being out of place, like I didn't belong there anymore. I quickly went back to the group, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want to sound paranoid or worse, like I was making something out of nothing. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the unease I felt. Every time I looked into the fire, I could still see the tuning forks in my mind, standing up in that eerie circle, silent and still. The next morning, I woke up early. I hadn't slept much. I kept thinking about that strange clearing and the feeling of being watched. I didn't want to tell the others. I wasn't sure if they would think I was overreacting, or if they'd just laugh it off. We packed up our gear and started hiking back out. But the whole time, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, or someone, lurking in the trees. It wasn't like I believed in anything supernatural, but there was something about that circle, the way it felt when I was standing there, that made me question everything I thought I knew about the woods. As we hiked out, I couldn't help but glance over at the spot where I had seen the circle. The clearing was empty now, the dirt disturbed by the rain that had fallen the night before. The tuning forks were gone. Maybe it had all been in my head. Maybe I had just been too tired, too jumpy from the hike. But there was something about it that still bothered me, something I couldn't shake. I never told anyone what I saw, and I never went back to that spot. But I know one thing for sure: some things are meant to be left alone. I'm not superstitious, but I know when to trust my instincts. And that night, my gut told me to walk away and never look back. And I never have. I've always loved the outdoors. Growing up, I spent more time in the woods behind my childhood home than inside the house. When I became a father, I was determined to share that same sense of adventure with my kids. They were still young. Charlie was 9, and Megan was only 6, but I figured a short hike to a nearby cave would be the perfect way to ease them into exploring nature. The cave was only a 10-minute drive from our house. It wasn't anything special by spelunking standards, just a small cavern you could walk through in about half an hour. Locals knew about it, but it wasn't exactly a tourist destination. So I wasn't surprised when we pulled up to the small dirt parking lot and found it empty. "Wow, Dad, this looks like something out of a movie," Charlie exclaimed as he hopped out of the car. Megan, ever the quieter one, stuck close to me, clutching her little pink flashlight like it was a magic wand. The air smelled damp, a mix of wet soil and decaying leaves. The entrance to the cave was wide and inviting, framed by a cluster of moss-covered rocks. I double-checked our gear, flashlights, snacks, and a small first aid kit, then led the kids toward the opening. "Stay close to me," I said, more out of habit than concern. The cave wasn't deep enough to get lost in, and the path was straightforward. Still, caves can be unpredictable, and I wasn't taking any chances with my kids. Inside, the temperature dropped noticeably. The walls glistened with moisture, and the ground was a mix of packed dirt and patches of sticky mud. I let Charlie take the lead, his flashlight beam bouncing excitedly as he darted ahead. Megan stayed by my side, her small hand occasionally brushing against mine for reassurance. We walked for about 15 minutes before reaching the halfway point. There was a small chamber here where the ceiling rose higher, giving the space an almost cathedral-like quality. A narrow passage on the far side led to the other exit, but I knew from experience it got tight and muddy beyond that point. "Can we go all the way through?" Charlie asked, his eyes lighting up. "Not today, buddy," I said, ruffling his hair. "It's too muddy, and I don't want us getting stuck. We'll head back the way we came." He groaned but didn't argue. Megan looked relieved. We turned around and started retracing our steps. I felt good, relaxed even. The kids were enjoying themselves, and the whole outing seemed to be going smoothly. But about 5 minutes into the return trip, something stopped me in my tracks. There, about 8 feet up the wall on our left, was a candle. It wasn't one of those battery-powered camping lanterns or a random piece of trash someone left behind. This was an actual wax candle, its orange flame flickering faintly against the damp rock. My stomach tightened. I was certain that candle hadn't been there when we came through the first time. The wall it sat on was smooth and bare, with no ledges or crevices where a candle could hide unnoticed. And there was no one else in the cave. At least there shouldn't have been. I felt a rush of adrenaline as every protective instinct I had kicked into overdrive. I glanced at the kids. Charlie was oblivious, shining his flashlight ahead. Megan noticed the change in my expression and tugged at my sleeve. "Dad? What's wrong?" I forced a smile, though my heart was pounding. "Nothing, sweetheart. Let's keep moving." I ushered them forward, my mind racing. Someone had to have lit that candle. Someone who was in the cave with us. The thought made my skin crawl. I scanned the darkness behind us, my flashlight sweeping over the walls and floor. Nothing. But that didn't mean we were alone. I kept the kids close as we walked, moving faster than before. My ears strained for any sound, footsteps, breathing, anything. But all I could hear was the drip of water and the soft squelch of our boots in the mud. The candle haunted me. Who had lit it? Why? Were they watching us now? Halfway to the entrance, I stopped again. My flashlight caught something on the ground, a fresh footprint in the mud. It wasn't ours. The tread pattern was different, and it was larger than my boot. Whoever it belonged to had passed through here recently, probably after we entered the cave. My chest tightened as I realized they could be anywhere, hidden in the shadows just beyond the reach of our lights. "Charlie, Megan, stay right next to me," I said, my voice firmer than before. "Don't wander off." Charlie frowned, sensing my seriousness, but didn't argue. Megan clung to my arm, her small fingers digging into my jacket. The rest of the walk felt like an eternity. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone step out of the darkness. Every sound, a drop of water, a scuff of our boots, made my nerves flare. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Finally, we reached the entrance. The late afternoon sunlight spilling into the cave felt like a blessing. I didn't stop moving until we were outside, breathing the fresh air. Only then did I allow myself to relax, just a little. But as I turned to look back at the cave, something caught my eye. In the dim light of the entrance, I saw another candle, perched on a rock near the wall. It wasn't lit. My first instinct was to grab the kids and run, but I forced myself to think rationally. The unlit candle wasn't a threat. It was just a candle. But the fact that it was there meant whoever had been inside the cave had either left it behind or was still nearby. I scanned the woods around us, my pulse pounding. The parking lot was empty, and the surrounding trees offered too many places to hide. I didn't see or hear anyone, but the sense of being watched was almost overwhelming. "Come on, kids," I said, keeping my voice calm. "Let's head home." We walked quickly to the car, and I kept looking over my shoulder the entire time. I loaded the kids into their seats, locked the doors, and started the engine. As we pulled out of the lot, I glanced at the rearview mirror one last time. There was no one there. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I kept replaying the day in my head, trying to make sense of what had happened. The candle, the footprints, the unlit one by the entrance. It all felt deliberate, like someone had been toying with us. But why? And who? I didn't sleep much. Every creak of the house made me tense. half expecting to see a shadow outside the window. But nothing happened. The next morning, I debated whether to report the incident. There wasn't much to tell, really, just a candle and some footprints. It wasn't exactly a crime. In the end, I decided to let it go. But I haven't taken my kids back to that cave. And I never will. It's not the cave that scares me. It's the thought of who might still be waiting inside. It was the summer of 2003 when I decided to take on a hiking trip I'd been planning for months. The Hoh Rainforest on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington was my destination, and my goal was ambitious: hike from the Pacific Ocean to Mount Olympus. It was a trek that demanded preparation, endurance, and no small amount of luck with the weather. I'd done my homework, packed carefully, and felt ready for the challenge. Day one went exactly as planned. I set off early in the morning, my gear snugly packed and my spirits high. The forest was alive, vibrant with the kind of natural beauty that pictures never quite capture. Sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, dappling the ground in patches of gold. Birds chirped overhead, and the Hoh River ran alongside me, its gentle gurgle providing a soothing backdrop. By the end of the day, I'd covered the distance I'd hoped for, set up camp near the river, and slept like a rock under the stars. Then came day two. I woke up to a dense fog that clung to everything like a wet blanket. Visibility was maybe 20 feet at best. The air was damp and cold, seeping through my jacket and into my bones. I wasn't too worried at first. Fog in a rainforest wasn't exactly unheard of. I figured it would lift by mid-morning. Didn't. By noon, the fog was still so thick I could barely see the path ahead. My GPS struggled to get a fix, leaving me to rely on the river as my guide. As long as I followed it upstream, I'd stay on course, but the lack of visibility was starting to wear on me. Everything felt disorienting, like I was walking in circles even though I knew I wasn't. By late afternoon, the fog showed no signs of letting up. My unease grew with every step. I'd been hiking for hours and hadn't seen another soul. The forest, which had felt so welcoming the day before, now seemed alien and oppressive. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me jump. I told myself it was just the fog playing tricks on my mind. I eventually stumbled upon a clearing large enough to set up camp. It wasn't ideal, there wasn't much cover, but I didn't have the energy to push on. The fog was still heavy, and the light was fading fast. I pitched my tent, unpacked a power bar, and tried to relax as the forest around me descended into darkness. And what a darkness it was. I'd never experienced anything like it before. The fog absorbed what little light the stars and moon offered, leaving me in a black so complete it felt suffocating. Even with my flashlight, the beam barely cut through the murk. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the tent ceiling and listening to the forest sounds. The distant hoot of an owl, the soft rustle of leaves, the occasional crack of a branch. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard it, a low, rhythmic huffing sound. It was faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the ambient noises of the forest. But as I focused, it grew louder. It wasn't the wind or the sound of the river. It was something breathing, something close. My chest tightened, and my pulse quickened. I stayed still, straining my ears to locate the source. The huffing came again, slow and steady, like the breathing of a large animal. My mind raced. A bear? No, it didn't sound like a bear. The rhythm was wrong. I reached for my flashlight, my hand trembling as I gripped it. I sat up slowly, careful not to make any noise. The sound was coming from my right, maybe 5 feet away. My stomach churned with a sick mix of fear and curiosity. I couldn't just sit there, waiting for whatever it was to make the next move. I pulled the drawstring on the tent door as quietly as I could and poked my head out. Nothing. The fog was as thick as ever, and the darkness pressed in from all sides. I shivered, partly from the cold and partly from the dread creeping up my spine. Then the huffing came again, louder this time, and I whipped my flashlight toward the source. The beam of light illuminated a pair of massive antlers. My breath caught in my throat as I realized I was staring at a Roosevelt elk, one of the largest elk species in the world. The animal was enormous, easily weighing over 1,000 pounds, and it stood not 5 feet from my tent. Its dark, glassy eyes reflected the flashlight, giving it an otherworldly appearance. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then the elk let out a startled grunt, turned to bolt, and ran straight into a tree. The sound of the impact was loud enough to make me flinch. The elk staggered, its massive body swaying as it tried to regain its footing. Then it collapsed to the ground with a heavy thud, the forest going eerily silent in its wake. I stayed frozen in my tent, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe too loudly. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, it was hard to tell. Eventually, I heard the elk groan, followed by the sound of it scrambling to its feet. It grunted again, a deep, guttural noise, and then I heard the heavy thud of its hooves as it disappeared into the fog. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When dawn finally broke, the fog had lifted slightly, and the forest felt less oppressive. I packed up my camp in record time, my nerves still raw from the encounter. As I hiked upstream, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I'd been to such a massive animal. It could have trampled me in its panic, but instead, we'd both walked away unscathed. By the time I reached the next campsite, the sun was out and the forest was alive again. Birds sang, and the river sparkled in the light. The terror of the previous night began to fade, replaced by a deep respect for the wilderness and its inhabitants. That trip taught me a lot, not just about hiking, but about the unpredictable beauty and danger of nature. I never did see another elk that close again, but every time I think back to that night, I can still hear its huffing breath in the darkness. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, painting the Santa Monica Mountains with streaks of gold and soft shadows. I'd been looking forward to this hike all week. Work had been grueling, the city noisy, and my brain a cluttered mess. I needed this, a quiet 5-mile loop to clear my head and stretch my legs. I parked at the trailhead just as the sun began its descent. The air was warm but carried a faint, cooling breeze that hinted at the coming night. I threw on my small backpack, adjusted the straps, and started up the dusty trail. The first mile passed easily. My boots crunched against the gravel, birds called to each other in the chaparral, and the horizon glowed a hazy orange. The scent of sagebrush filled the air, sharp and earthy. I'd read somewhere that mountain lions occasionally prowled these trails, but I wasn't worried. I'd hiked this area before, and the solitude was one of the things I loved most about it. But as I reached the second mile, something changed. The trail grew quieter. The birds had stopped their chatter, and the breeze had died down. The stillness was odd, but I shrugged it off. It was dusk after all. Maybe the wildlife was settling in for the night. The path ahead curved around a hill, cutting through a thicket of dense shrubs. The light was dimmer now, the sun slipping lower, and I instinctively quickened my pace. Hiking alone at dusk always carried a strange duality. Peaceful but with an edge of unease. It was as I rounded the bend that I saw him. First, it was just a shape, a lone figure walking toward me, still far enough away that I couldn't make out any details. My first thought was relief. It's always nice to pass another hiker when you're out alone. It breaks the isolation for a moment. But as the figure drew closer, that relief twisted into something else. He was an older man, probably in his late 50s or early 60s. His build was solid but not intimidating, and he wore a simple t-shirt and cargo pants. His steps were steady, his posture relaxed, yet there was something about him that made me uneasy. It wasn't until he was within about 20 feet that it hit me. The face. I knew that face. My mind scrambled to place it, and then it clicked all at once. Yamegumba. Buffalo Bill. The silence of the lambs. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart thudding in my chest. I'd seen that movie countless times, and his performance had always unsettled me. He wasn't just playing a character, he was the character in that film. The way he moved, the way he spoke, it had stuck with me for years. And now here he was, the same face, the same sad eyes. He must have seen the recognition on my face because his expression changed. He looked tired, resigned, like he'd been through this 1,000 times before. His eyes met mine, and in that brief moment, I felt something strange. Not fear exactly, but discomfort. I wanted to believe he wasn't like the character he'd played, that it was just a role, but the unease wouldn't leave me. We passed each other with no words exchanged, just a fleeting moment of shared awareness. His expression lingered in my mind as I continued down the trail. I quickened my pace, the crunch of gravel underfoot louder than before. I didn't look back, not yet. My chest felt tight, my breathing shallow. The trail was empty again, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Finally, after about 100 yards, I turned around. The man was gone. The trail stretched empty behind me, the curve of the hill swallowing up the spot where we'd crossed paths. The silence was louder now, pressing in on me from all sides. I told myself to keep moving. It was just a coincidence, just another hiker, but my brain wouldn't let it go. My mind replayed the moment over and over, dissecting every detail of his face, his expression, his posture. By the time I reached the 3rd mile, the sun had dipped below the horizon. The trail was shrouded in deep shadows, and the moon was just starting to rise. I fished my flashlight out of my pack, the beam cutting a narrow path through the darkness. Every rustle in the bushes made me jump. Every shadow looked like a figure. I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed, even though I knew it was irrational. The final stretch of the loop felt endless. My legs were burning, and my breath came in short bursts, but I didn't stop. I just wanted to be back at my car, to lock the doors and leave this strange encounter behind. When I finally reached the trailhead, the lot was nearly empty. My car was one of the last remaining vehicles, and the sight of it brought a wave of relief. I climbed in, locked the doors, and sat there for a moment, staring out at the dark trailhead. I never saw him again. For weeks after, I couldn't stop thinking about that hike, about the man who had played one of the most infamous villains in film history, about the way he'd looked at me, knowing exactly what I was thinking. I wanted to believe that he was just an actor, just a man trying to live his life. But something about that encounter stayed with me. The quiet, the stillness, the way the air had seemed heavier after we passed each other. I still hike the Santa Monica Mountains sometimes, but never at dusk, and never alone. The decision to live in a national park for 3 months wasn't spontaneous. It was something I'd planned for years, a retreat from the noise of life, an opportunity to reset. The isolation didn't bother me. If anything, it appealed to me. The park was sprawling, with towering pines, winding trails, and wildlife that reminded you just how small you were. My trailer sat on a secluded patch of land near an old, seldom used dirt road. No other campers were nearby, and the nearest ranger station was about 20 miles away. I was entirely alone. The days were serene. Mornings began with the sounds of birdsong filtering through the trees, and evenings were quiet except for the occasional rustle of wind or an animal passing through the underbrush. Nights were darker than anything I'd experienced before, the stars shining so brightly they seemed surreal. It was everything I'd hoped for, but after the first few weeks, I began to notice something strange. Several times, as I returned to my trailer after a hike or a day of reading by the creek, I would hear music. It wasn't faint or far off, like someone playing a radio in the distance. It was loud and clear, like a music box or an old-fashioned ice cream truck. The first time I heard it, I froze. It was such an unnatural sound in the middle of the forest. I looked around, trying to locate the source, but it seemed to be coming from above me, somewhere high in the trees. The melody was repetitive, cheerful yet eerie in the way certain old tunes can be. I shook it off, chalking it up to fatigue or maybe an odd echo from some distant campsite I hadn't noticed. But as I made my way back to the trailer, the music followed me, fading in and out like it was riding the breeze. This happened several more times over the next few weeks. It always seemed to happen late in the day when I was heading back to the trailer. The music would begin suddenly, hanging in the air above me, and stop just as abruptly before I could pinpoint its source. I told myself it was nothing to worry about. Sound carries strangely in the wilderness. Maybe it was an old wind-up toy someone had left behind, catching the wind just right. Maybe it was my imagination, but the feeling it gave me was hard to ignore. The music didn't belong here. One evening, the curiosity got the better of me. I decided I was going to find the source. The music started just as I reached the dirt road leading to my trailer. Instead of continuing home, I turned and followed the road further into the forest. The sounds seemed to pull me along. I couldn't tell if I was getting closer or if the music was simply moving with me. It played on a loop, the same cheerful tune over and over, growing neither louder nor softer. My eyes scanned the treetops, expecting to see something, anything, that could explain it. I wasn't paying attention to where I was stepping. My foot came down inches from a copperhead stretched across the road. I jerked back with a gasp, my heart pounding, but the snake didn't move. Its body was still, its eyes cloudy, dead. As I caught my breath, I noticed another copperhead a few feet away, and another. In total, there were 6 of them, all lying dead in a line across the road. They were perfectly aligned, their heads pointed in the same direction, facing deeper into the forest. My stomach churned. The sight was unnatural, unnerving. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the snakes, before the music jolted me back to reality. It was still playing, still somewhere ahead of me. I couldn't bring myself to step over the snakes. I didn't even want to get close to them. Instead, I turned and walked quickly back to the trailer, the music fading behind me. Once inside, I locked the door and sat down to steady my nerves. The sight of those snakes wouldn't leave my mind. It felt like a warning, though I couldn't say of what. I told myself I'd been out there long enough for one day. I'd go back tomorrow with my car, drive past the snakes, and figure out what was making that music. But the next day, the music didn't come, nor did it come the day after that. Weeks passed, and I didn't hear it again. I didn't see any more dead snakes either. Life in the park returned to its usual rhythm, but I couldn't shake the unease. The last week of my stay, I decided to hike back down that dirt road one more time. It had been bothering me that I never found the source of the music. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but I felt compelled to try. The road was quiet, the forest still. I reached the spot where I'd seen the snakes, but there was no sign of them now, not even bones. The dirt looked undisturbed, as if they'd never been there at all. I walked further, deeper into the forest than I'd gone before. The trees grew denser, the light dimmer. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to hear the music again. But all I heard was the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional rustle of animals in the brush. Eventually, the road ended in a clearing. There was nothing there, just an open patch of ground surrounded by trees. No buildings, no discarded objects, no clues. It was as if the music had never existed. I stood there for a long time, listening to the silence. I felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. On the walk back, I kept thinking about those snakes, about how unnatural they'd looked lying there in perfect alignment. The image stayed with me even as I packed up my trailer and left the park a few days later. To this day, I don't know what I heard out there. Maybe it was just sound carrying strangely through the forest. Maybe it was some animal or insect I didn't recognize. Or maybe it was something I wasn't meant to understand. Whatever it was, I haven't been back to that park since. I've never been one for dramatic storytelling, but some things stick with you no matter how much time passes. It was back in 1992 when my friend Dave and I decided to go on a bushwalking trip in New South Wales. It was supposed to be a break from the grind, two blokes out in nature, leaving the noise of the city behind. We didn't know it at the time, but that trip would etch itself into my memory forever. We'd chosen Belanglo State Forest for our trek. It wasn't as popular back then as it is now, and that was part of the appeal. It felt untouched. There were no crowded trails, no tourists with their oversized cameras and loud chatter. Just the two of us, the quiet of the forest, and the crunch of leaves underfoot. The plan was simple. A couple of nights camping under the stars, a chance to clear our heads. The first day was uneventful. We set up camp near a clearing with a decent view of the sunset. The forest was alive but calm. The sound of birds and the occasional rustling in the underbrush our only companions. After dinner, we sat around the fire, swapping stories and sipping on a flask of whiskey Dave had brought along. The stars were out in full force that night, scattered like diamonds across the black sky. The next morning, we decided to explore deeper into the forest. Dave had brought along a map, though neither of us was particularly skilled at reading it. Still, we weren't too worried. We stuck to the general direction we'd planned and kept an eye out for landmarks. It was around midday when we stumbled upon something odd. The forest had grown denser, the trees pressing in close, their branches intertwining overhead and casting a patchwork of shadows on the ground. We were following a faint trail when we saw it, a platform-like structure made entirely of rocks. At first glance, it didn't seem like much, just a pile of stones stacked neatly in a small clearing. But as we got closer, something about it felt wrong. The rocks weren't just randomly piled up. They were arranged with purpose, forming a flat, almost altar-like surface about waist-high. Around its base were smaller stones, arranged in a circular pattern. "Looks like someone's been here," Dave said, his voice breaking the silence. I nodded but didn't respond. There was something unsettling about it. The air felt heavier here, the quiet deeper. The forest seemed to hold its breath, as if we were intruding on something we weren't meant to see. We didn't stick around long. After snapping a couple of photos on Dave's old film camera, we pressed on, leaving the strange structure behind. Neither of us mentioned it again that day, but the image of those rocks lingered in my mind. The rest of the trip passed without incident. We made it back to civilization, exhausted but satisfied. Life went on, the memory of that odd platform fading into the background as work and routine took over. Months later, though, it all came rushing back. I was at home one evening, flipping through channels on the TV, when a news report caught my attention. The headline read, Asterisk, Backpacker Murders. Police uncover shocking evidence. Asterisk, the footage showed a grim-faced reporter standing in a clearing surrounded by bushland. Behind her, partially obscured by trees, was a familiar sight. A platform of rocks eerily similar to the one Dave and I had found. I sat there, frozen, as the story unfolded. Over the past few years, several backpackers had gone missing in the area. Their remains were discovered buried in shallow graves, each site marked by one of these altars. The police were calling them ritualistic, though no one could say for certain what they were for. Then came the name Ivan Milat. He'd been arrested on suspicion of the murders, and the evidence against him was damning. Personal belongings of the victims had been found in his possession, along with firearms that matched bullet casings at the crime scenes. The news anchor described him as Australia's worst serial killer, responsible for the brutal deaths of at least 7 young backpackers. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My mind raced back to that day in the forest, to the platform we'd found. It was the same down to the smallest detail. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Dave and I had stumbled onto one of those altars. I called Dave immediately. He answered after a few rings, his voice groggy. "Mate, turn on the news," I said, barely able to keep the panic out of my voice. "What's going on? Just do it." A few minutes later, he called me back. "Jesus Christ," he said. "That's the thing we found, isn't it?" "Yeah," I replied, my throat dry. "It is." For weeks after that, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The proximity of those altars to the graves, the sinister purpose they seemed to serve, it made my skin crawl. But what haunted me most was the thought of how close we'd come to danger. Milat had been active in the area for years. For all we knew, he could have been nearby that day, watching us from the shadows. The trial dragged on for months, dominating the news. Milat was eventually convicted and sentenced to life in prison, but rumors persisted. Some believed he hadn't acted alone, that there was at least one other person involved in the murders. The police couldn't prove it, though, and the case was officially closed. Even now, decades later, I can't shake the feeling that we narrowly escaped something terrible. I've never gone back to Belanglo State Forest, and I doubt I ever will. The memory of that altar, the weight of the air around it, is enough to keep me away. They say the bush has secrets, that it hides things better left undiscovered. I believe it. Some places aren't meant to be explored, and some memories are better left buried. But no matter how hard I try, I can't forget the platform of rocks, or the knowledge that, for a brief moment, I stood on the edge of something far darker than I ever could have imagined. The air was thin at 10,500 feet, and I could feel it with every step as we climbed higher, leaving behind the dense pines and gaining the wide, sweeping views of Yellowstone's rugged terrain. My pack felt heavier than usual, though I knew I hadn't added anything extra. Just the weight of the altitude, the burn in my legs, and the odd sense of isolation that comes with hiking at this kind of elevation. The trees, far below, seemed to shrink into little clumps, and the lake ahead of us glittered like a mirror under the midday sun. We had been trekking for hours along the ridge above the lake, following a narrow trail that hugged the edge of the cliff. It wasn't the first time we had seen oddities along the trail. Nature has a way of hiding its secrets in the most unlikely places. But this was something different. Something that stood out so starkly against the backdrop of the wilderness that I couldn't shake the feeling it was some sort of omen. First, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a dark shape on the side of the trail, partially hidden in the underbrush. But as I got closer, it became clear. It was a horse skull, perched eerily on a pile of scattered bones. There was no body, no remains of any other part of the animal, just the skull. It was bleached white from the sun, its hollow eye sockets staring up at us, and the jagged edges of the teeth still visible in its open jaw. We stopped for a moment, looking at it. It seemed out of place here, high above the tree line, like it had been placed there intentionally, though that didn't make sense. It was just a skull, yet the way it sat there made me feel uneasy. There was nothing else, no carcass, no remains of anything else. Just the skull and the empty space around it. After a few moments, we shrugged it off. A strange find, sure, but nothing more than that. We continued on our way, heading for a campsite near the lake that I had been planning to set up for the night. It wasn't much farther, and the weather was good, clear skies and the promise of a peaceful evening by the water. As we descended from the ridge and made our way down to the lake, the air became cooler, the scent of the pines growing stronger. We found a spot on the shore, not far from the water's edge, where the ground was flat and covered in a layer of soft grass. There, we set up camp, unpacked our gear, and got a fire going. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the lake and the surrounding hills. After a while, we decided to make our way down to the water. The lake was crystal clear, the kind of blue that seemed almost unreal. I couldn't resist getting closer, wanting to dip my fingers in the cool water and maybe take a quick swim. But as I walked along the shore, I saw it. Something white, half submerged near the edge of the lake. At first, I thought it was a rock, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't. It was the body of the horse. Its carcass was bloated and rotten, its flesh peeling away in places, exposing the bones beneath. The smell was thick, like something had been left to decay for too long under the hot sun. The fur was matted and blackened in some places, and its eyes had long since sunk into the skull, leaving empty sockets behind. What struck me even more than the body itself were the strips of film. They were everywhere, floating on the water, scattered across the shoreline like some forgotten relic from another time. They looked like old negatives, the kind of film strips you'd find in a photographer's darkroom, curled and faded with age, with the faint outlines of images still visible in the black and white frames. Some were tangled in the body of the horse, others were strewn along the edge of the water, caught in the long grasses that grew along the shore. I bent down to pick one up, my hands trembling slightly. Felt like a bad idea, but something about them called to me. The images on the film were too difficult to make out, blurred and warped by time and the water, but I could see enough to know they were not of anything natural. They weren't images of animals or landscapes, but something else, something that didn't belong here. I dropped the strip back into the water, feeling a strange unease crawling up my spine. I turned to leave to head back to the camp, but as I glanced back at the horse's body, I noticed something else, something that made my heart stop for a moment. There were marks on the ground around the body, long, deep grooves like something had been dragged across the earth. They weren't animal tracks. They were too neat, too precise. They looked almost human. I felt my pulse quicken, and I turned back toward the camp without another word. We didn't talk much that night. The fire crackled in the silence, casting flickering shadows around the campsite. The whole place felt wrong, like something was lurking just out of sight, watching us. I didn't want to say anything to the others, not yet, but the thought of those film strips and the marks around the horse's body kept gnawing at me. What had happened here? Why had we found this? As the night wore on, I kept glancing toward the lake, half expecting to see something, or someone, watching us from the shadows. But there was nothing, just the darkness and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. We packed up the next morning, eager to leave the place behind. The unease from the night before lingered, and I kept my eyes on the trail, not wanting to look back. We didn't speak of the horse's body or the film again, but I could feel the weight of it in the air between us, pressing down on everything. We made our way back down the mountain, and the further we got from the lake, the lighter I felt. When we reached the parking lot, I thought about asking the rangers if they knew anything about the strange find, but something held me back. What could I say? That we had found a dead horse by the lake, surrounded by strange film strips? Sounded insane. But as I sat in the car, driving away from the mountain, I glanced at my pack and noticed something strange. One of the film strips had somehow made its way into my gear. I could see it sticking out from the corner of the flap. I reached over and pulled it out, my heart sinking in my chest. The images on the strip were clearer now, but they weren't pictures of the landscape. They were pictures of us, of me standing by the horse's body, the strange marks on the ground, and the campfire. The last frame was of the skull, back at the ridge, staring at the camera with those empty eye sockets. I don't know how it ended up in my pack. I don't know who took the pictures, or why they were left behind. But looking at that strip, I realized something. The wilderness had its own way of remembering things, and some memories, once made, couldn't be erased. It's been years since that trip, but every time I pass through Yellowstone or see a horse on the side of the road, I remember that moment, those pictures, and the feeling that something was watching, waiting, and I still don't know what to make of it. I still think about that cage sometimes, even though it's been years since I found it. I don't know what it was for, and I've stopped trying to make sense of it. But every time I close my eyes and imagine it, I feel the same unease, like I'm right back there in the mountains above Missoula, Montana, with the dry air and the crunch of loose gravel under my boots. It was late September when I decided to go hiking. Fall in Montana is beautiful, and the weather was cool but not too cold yet. I lived in a small house near the edge of town, surrounded by pine trees and hills. From my backyard, you could see the mountains rising up in the distance, and I often wandered up there to clear my head. There weren't many marked trails in that area, mostly just game trails and some old logging roads, but I preferred it that way. I liked the sense of solitude. That day, I left around mid-morning. I packed light, just a water bottle, a granola bar, and my pocket knife. I wasn't planning to go far. The goal was just to climb to a ridgeline I'd noticed from my porch. It wasn't the tallest peak in the area, but it had a clear view of the valley below. I figured it would take maybe 45 minutes to get there, give or take. The first part of the hike was straightforward. I followed a narrow deer trail through the trees, winding my way uphill. The air smelled like pine needles and damp earth. Every so often, I'd stop to catch my breath and listen to the sounds of the forest. Birds chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, the distant hum of a plane overhead. As I climbed higher, the trail faded, and I had to pick my way through the underbrush. It wasn't too dense, but there were enough fallen branches and thorny bushes to slow me down. I kept going, aiming for a break in the trees that I assumed was the ridgeline. When I reached the top, I stopped to take in the view. From up there, I could see the whole valley spread out below me. Patches of green forest, golden fields, and the rooftops of houses in the distance. The air was cooler up there, and I could feel a slight breeze on my face. It was peaceful, but then I noticed something on the far side of the ridge, just a little ways downhill. At first, I thought it was some kind of structure, maybe an old shed or a hunting blind. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't like anything I'd seen before. It was a cage. Not a small animal trap, but a full-sized cage, big enough to hold at least 5 or 10 people. The frame was made of steel bars, round and smooth, with a dull gray finish that didn't reflect much light. The walls and ceiling were made of thick, sturdy rope woven into a grid, almost like chain link but softer looking. The ropes were taut and undamaged, as if they'd been installed recently. The cage was just sitting there, in the middle of a clearing with no obvious purpose or explanation. There was no trail leading to it, no footprints or tire tracks in the dirt. The ground around it was undisturbed, as if it had been placed there from above. I walked around it cautiously, keeping a few feet of distance. The door of the cage was closed but not locked. It had a simple latch that could be opened from the outside. Inside, there was nothing. No debris, no signs of use, just bare ground covered in a thin layer of pine needles. The more I looked at it, the less sense it made. Who would go through the trouble of building something like this and then leave it in such a remote spot? And why use rope instead of chain link? The rope seemed strong enough, but it didn't look like it was designed to last. I reached out and touched one of the ropes. It was rough and slightly damp, with a faint smell of mildew. I tugged on it gently and it held firm. Whatever this thing was, it hadn't been sitting here for long. I felt a creeping unease settle over me. The cage wasn't threatening in any obvious way. It wasn't booby-trapped, and there were no signs of violence or danger. But there was something deeply unsettling about its presence. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong there, and neither did I. I thought about going inside for a closer look, but the idea made my skin crawl. Instead, I took a step back and scanned the surrounding area. The clearing was completely empty, surrounded by dense trees on all sides. There were no signs of human activity, no campfire rings, no trash, no footprints. It was as if the cage had appeared out of nowhere. I stood there for a while, trying to make sense of it. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it some kind of art installation? A bizarre hunting setup? A prank? But none of those explanations seemed right. Eventually, I decided to leave. I didn't want to stick around and risk running into whoever had put the cage there. As I turned to head back down the ridge, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The cage looked smaller from a distance, almost insignificant, but the feeling of unease stayed with me. The hike back down was quicker but no less unsettling. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. The forest felt quieter than before, the shadows longer and darker. When I got home, I locked the doors and closed the curtains. I couldn't stop thinking about the cage. I wanted to tell someone about it, but I didn't know how to explain it without sounding crazy. Instead, I stayed up late, staring at the ceiling and replaying the discovery in my mind. The next day, I went back to the ridge with my camera, determined to document the cage and figure out what it was. But when I got to the clearing, it was gone. There was no trace of it. No ropes, no steel bars, not even an impression in the dirt where it had been. The ground was completely undisturbed, as if the cage had never been there at all. I stood there for a long time trying to make sense of it. Eventually, I turned and walked back down the ridge, feeling more confused than ever. I never told anyone about the cage. Every so often, I think about hiking back up there to see if it's returned, but I haven't worked up the nerve. Maybe it's better that way. Some things aren't meant to be understood. The story I'm about to tell you is one I've shared with many people over the years. Most of them didn't believe me. Some even laughed, thinking I was making it all up. But I'm telling you, this story is true. I swear it on everything, as true as the sky is blue. It all started when my family and I moved into a new house. The house was tucked away in a remote area, far from the busy streets, with dense forests surrounding it on all sides. It was the kind of place where you could get lost in the woods without realizing it, and I loved it for that reason. My brother and I were excited about the adventure of living somewhere so secluded. Even though we didn't know much about the area at the time, we were still getting used to our new surroundings, learning where everything was and what paths we could take for walks. On this particular afternoon, we decided to explore the woods nearby. The sun was out, and the air was fresh, perfect for a hike. My brother and I grabbed our bags, threw on some old sneakers, and headed out the back door. The woods were thick with trees, and the path we walked on was little more than a well-worn trail through the underbrush. We hadn't walked too far when we stumbled upon a small, open field. It was a break in the trees, and the grass was green and thick, almost like a natural clearing in the woods. At first, it felt peaceful. The kind of place where you could stretch out on the grass and take a nap, or just watch the clouds drift by. But then something caught my eye. There was a person in the middle of the field. At first, I thought it might have been someone we knew, maybe a neighbor or someone from the nearby town. We had met a few people since we moved in, and there was a chance this person was one of them. I squinted, but I didn't have my glasses on, so I couldn't make out the details. My brother had started to walk ahead of me, and I hurried to catch up, thinking I could get a better look. The person was wearing a blue jacket, bright, almost a vivid blue. They were crouched down, bent over something. I figured they might be inspecting something in the grass, maybe gathering plants or doing something harmless. But as I drew closer, something felt off. I slowed down a little, still unsure what I was seeing, but curious enough to approach. The figure didn't seem to notice us, or if they did, they weren't paying any attention. But then, as I got closer, my stomach dropped. I could see now that the person wasn't just looking at something in the grass. They were hunched over what looked like a deer, its body laying still on the ground, its fur matted with blood. The man, or at least I thought it was a man, was stabbing it with something. The tool he was using wasn't a knife or anything sharp. It was just a stick, plain, unsharpened stick. I froze in place, and my heart started racing in my chest. The man's movements were jerky, like he was caught in some sort of trance, stabbing the deer over and over again. It was disturbing, to say the least. There was no way this was normal. I couldn't understand what was happening. He didn't seem to notice me for a moment, but then he paused. He slowly turned his head toward me. His eyes locked onto mine, and in that instant, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. His gaze wasn't just curious or surprised. It was almost empty, like there was nothing there, nothing human about it. I don't know what made me act the way I did next. Maybe it was the fear that gripped me or the instinct to run. Either way, I turned around and screamed my brother's name. "Run!" I yelled, panic rising in my voice. Without thinking, we both bolted. I didn't care about the trail or the way back. All I cared about was getting out of there, and fast. My legs were moving before I even realized what I was doing, pushing through the thick underbrush, jumping over fallen logs and weaving around trees. My breath was ragged, and my heart was pounding like it was going to burst. I glanced back once, just once, and that was enough to make my blood run cold. The man hadn't moved. He was still standing in the middle of the field, staring at us. His gaze never wavered. He didn't chase us, didn't make a sound. He just stood there, like a statue. My brother and I kept running. We didn't stop. We didn't look back again. The woods seemed endless, the trees closing in around us. The farther we went, the more my fear grew. I couldn't shake the image of that man's face. His eyes, that deer. The whole thing felt unreal, but it was too vivid to ignore. By the time we reached home, I was gasping for air. We slammed the door behind us, and I locked it immediately. Neither of us spoke at first. We just stood there, trying to catch our breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My brother was the first to break the silence. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice shaking. He was as terrified as I was, but neither of us could explain what we had seen. We didn't talk about it much after that. We didn't tell our parents either. We didn't want to seem crazy, and we couldn't explain it in a way that made any sense. But we both knew what we saw, and that was enough. Over the years, I've thought about that day more times than I can count. I've tried to make sense of it, tried to rationalize it in my mind. Maybe the man was some kind of hunter, maybe he was just crazy, but nothing made sense. Who stabs a dead animal with a stick like that? And why was he so cold? It didn't feel like a normal encounter with a stranger. It felt wrong, like we had stumbled onto something we weren't supposed to see. After that day, we never went back to that field. We stayed away from that part of the woods altogether, even though we couldn't stop thinking about it. That feeling of being watched, of being so small and vulnerable, lingered in the back of my mind every time I ventured into the woods again. In the years that followed, I told a few people the story. I even told a couple of friends from school. But, as expected, most people didn't believe me. They said it was just a figment of my imagination, that we had misunderstood what we saw. Maybe we had gotten scared and made up the details they suggested. But I knew better. I knew what we saw, and I couldn't forget it. I'm older now, and I've lived through plenty of other strange things in my life, but nothing has ever felt quite as terrifying as that moment in the woods. I'll never forget the look in that man's eyes, the eerie stillness of the whole situation. Something wasn't right that day, and I've always wondered what would have happened if we hadn't run. So yeah, over the years, a lot of people didn't believe me, but I still remember it clearly, as true as the sky is blue.